Good morning and welcome everyone to my second webinar of this year's webinar series about corporate e-learning strategy and how to get your training right the first time round. And this time I want to focus on the science behind learning and the data we have available to actually get our training right so learning actually happens. Over the last years or for a long time, and I still come across it regularly, e-learning has actually had the stigma of being really dry and boring and not creating high engagement and actually leading to learning outcomes. But with more education around it, more authoring tools available and new technologies coming along, we hear all about, graphics, video animations and interactivity being the flesh and bones of a successful e-learning course and creating a high engagement factor. But what is then often forgotten about in all that excitement of engaging interactivity is how learning actually happens. What is the science behind learning and what kind of engagement really supports learning and what might be even more counterproductive. So I'm not saying that learning shouldn't be fun. Ideally, it is a lot of fun. But we need to remember what is our task. And our task is not to entertain our learners, but it is to present material in a way that people actually learn. And I want to give you an example. So if in my online course, I provide my users with a work environment to set the scene, and I have my office set up and even have that little radio on the shelf or on the desk that people can play around with for some interactive entertainment. It might be fun for the audience, and I'm sure your learners will remember that course where you could even play with the radio. But is that actually what we want? Well, I would say it depends on the scenario. If you are creating a course for your shift manager in your coffee shop, who for the first thing in the morning or when opening the shop needs to turn on the radio, then maybe yes. But if we are creating a course about increasing security at the workplace where learning outcomes focus on things like not putting your password on a sticky note on your desk or having your company ID just lying on your desk when you leave the room, this seemingly interesting interactivity might distract from what you actually want your learners to take away from the course. They should not focus on playing with the radio and then remember that. They should focus on security issues at the workplace and how to improve security at the workplace. So we should maybe forget about the radio because it is nice if people remember something and say oh well, this was a course where you could do all the fancy stuff. But when you then go and ask them what did you actually learn, they are not quite sure. So with all the easily accessible resources these days to create engaging interactive learning, we need to focus more on how learning happens and how we can best support it. So therefore, in this webinar, I will take a closer look at the science of learning and what this means for designing our online courses. So we get that engaging and interactive outcome, but actually have the science of learning there as well. So, and one other point that is often forgotten about is the power of importance and the importance of the data we have available to tailor our course to our audience. So similar to using an interactive element in the course, as I just described, because it might be nice, the same thing could happen with, for example, the use of specific technology to make our course mobile responsive. We say well, how about we put in some extra time and budget to make the course mobile responsive because everyone's on the phone all the time anyways. But actually, it turns out that we have really bad reception in our office or no Wi-Fi, or our people are not allowed to take the phones into the workplace or have them connected to the internet due to security reasons. And that way, we waste a fair bit of budget and time on additional technology that we don't need. So it is important that with everything and all the great technology we have available these days, we should not forget about making use of what we have on hand to ensure the best possible solution for what we know is best for our audience and what we know is best to increase learning outcomes, and not just what we think might be nice. And that's why we're here today. And I would like to start with the data-driven learning design, to have a quick look at where the data comes into place, and then we move on to the science behind learning. So the data-driven learning design, looking at the data, comes actually into play after we've done our training needs analysis, looking at our audience, the learning gaps, the needs and whatnot, but before we go into the development stage, because that data analysis gives us some good information. And then we can build a content in line with these preferences and continuously analyze the data and refine and adjust the content as we go, keeping it most relevant. So what kind of data can we look at? It might be everything you have available in your LMS. So the most viewed or completed content, mobile versus desktop usage. We have most consumed media type and length, and peak time for LMS usage. But what if you don't have an LMS? Well, look at your most visited intranet pages, or the search terms that are mostly used, or also like attendance and overtime and travel patterns can give you a good idea of when to launch an e-learning course, for example. So it is also further important that you look at data from only non-mandatory content, as this is the only way that you actually get the real reflection of what your learners do by choice and how long or short they stick with your content actually. And so this was just a brief overview. We could go deeper into that, but I really want to move on to the hard piece of this webinar, which is the science of learning. So the science of learning covers a wide range of research and theory and application. And whilst I find that the deeper you get into it, the more exciting it actually gets, we will only be able to scratch the surface in this webinar, or actually just a part of the surface, as it's a very broad field. And so I have picked what I see as the most crucial information addressing the main common practices in e-learning. And at the end, I will provide you with a selected list of references for further reading if you're interested. So the science behind learning. Learning is all about building and strengthening connections in the brain. Whenever we learn, our brain changes. The neurons in our brain grow while we learn, they get stronger and they build new connections. So the more we learn about and interact with one subject, the stronger these connections get and the more likely they are to stay long term. You could probably compare this to a spider's web. If you imagine a spider building up its web and just, doing its thing, building and building, just with one string per connection, going round and round and round, and then abandoning the net for a couple of days, coming back, the spider might not find much left of that net. However, if the spider puts in a little bit of effort and some repetitions and goes over the connections again and again and again, and like builds really good connections and really strong, strong connections, stronger strings, so to say, and then abandons the net for a couple of days, coming back, the net is a lot more likely to still be there. And if it needs repair, then it's probably just minor repair work to be done. So a takeaway here is the more we engage with the subject and the more different ways we use to engage with the topic, the more likely we are to retain the knowledge for longer. So this is just a small piece of information, but it's the foundation of everything that we know, or of everything included in the science of learning. And based on that, we can take away some implications for how we develop our learning content. And I want to take you through 6 of these implications that I find very important to consider. And we will talk through them, and I'll also provide you with some examples along the way on what that actually means for developing your online content. So what you already gathered from the introduction, it is we need to repeat content, but we need to vary the context. So very often we think about like, okay, so we need to repeat content. That means we just go through it again and again and again. But this cramming or rereading or mass practice is actually, as research shows, largely a waste of time. So you will create a new connection in your brain, but it would just be that one connection over and over again. So you have like your tiny little leg there. However, if you throw in something different, throw in something where you can connect the new content to what you already know, or put it like in a different context, you already have like, you might need to create a detour or like, connect with another connection. And that way you already have your piece of information basically standing on 3 legs instead of just one tiny one. And then you maybe just put it into a different perspective, different point of view from someone else. And that way you build more connections and it will just grow stronger and stronger. So the aim for successful learning design is therefore to provide information in different contexts. This can be, for example, a scenario that you put in like different times of the financial year or different cultural contexts or whatever makes sense for the kind of course that you're providing. Or you bring in different video statements from different people with different opinions, for example. So your learners need to interact with the topic from different point of views. And yes, immediately build more connections and stronger connections. So it is about repeating information in different ways. So it's not plain repetition of the same thing, but a way that creates multiple and strong connections in your learner's brain. Another thing that is really important to increase learning outcomes, and research shows how significant this is actually retrieval practice. We need to enable retrieval as learning is a two-way street. So what you put into your brain, you somehow need to be able to get out again. And that makes sense because you need the knowledge, but you also need to apply your knowledge or your skills. So regular retrieval practice keeps the brain from forgetting and strengthens your connections, the neurons. And it's basically like building a street. You have a one-way road, but you want to extend it to make it a two-way road. To get it like in and out again, you just need to make the road wider. And that's basically just what happens with your connections in the brain. And a simple form of retrieval that we often see in e-learning already is quick knowledge checks at the end of short modules, sub-modules, or at the end of a chapter. Now, this is good for retrieval. It is often misunderstood as grading the learner or, just for the trainer checking their knowledge, but it should really be for themselves. So they actually are required to do that retrieval practice. And it's important that we present that in a way that retrieval actually happens. If you put questions there that are like too deep or too confusing, people don't know what to do with it and just forget about it or guess, and retrieval won't happen. If we use, let's say, after every submodule, we have our 3 questions and they're all multiple choice and have like 5 options, with the 5th options always being all of the above. People won't read through the questions. They won't retrieve any kind of information. They'll just scan through looking for that all of the above tick box and click that. So we really need to make sure that this is, as it's such an important piece, yes, that is actually useful, or not just there for the sake of having some questions there. So what you can do is either you find the right questions and the right answer types, or you even let your learners type in some words, which will help retrieval even more, because people have to think about the words they use and they actually have to actively do something. You might know that from yourself. If you think about it in your head, it all makes sense and it's all good. But actually giving someone else the information is a lot harder, actually speaking the words, saying the words. And yes, getting your learners to do that will help them a lot. Or in another way, you just give them a scenario that is slightly different to what they've had to deal with when you presented the content initially. So they will have to retrieve the information in order to solve a problem, for example, but it is not your regular knowledge check of ticking a box that says all of the above. And then you might say, well, this is a lot of effort, or my learners might not appreciate that kind of effort, or you don't want to stress your learners too much with, like, you know, all the work going on and putting that effort in. But I tell you, effort really helps. So just like with everything you do, like working out or whatnot, the more effort you put in, yes, the better your outcomes are. It just does not necessarily mean that we need to feel the effort or your learners need to feel the effort. So if you give them, you know, again, another scenario, another problem to solve without giving them the necessary information beforehand on another slide, just throw them in, and they have to work around to find the solution, then obviously their brain has to work a lot harder than to just read something. And this is that piece of science of learning that you can take to explain why we don't just use like a slide presentation and then people will learn, because you actually have to put effort in. You have to like be immersed, think about it actively to get some learning results. So effort helps, but you don't necessarily have to feel or make your people feel like they're putting in all that effort. Another very important thing is you need to know what you don't know, or your learners need to know what they don't know in order to get the best learning results. It is, yes, you can think about it like building a bridge. You have two pieces of information, or like two sides of a river, that you need to connect, and you need to build a bridge. But if you know where to build that best, which parts can you best connect, that will help you a lot. Or your learners might be in denial of actually having to build the bridge or learn that new stuff to make the connection, because they think they already know it all. So they will be less inclined to actually work on something. So we need to make our learners aware of that knowledge gap, and learning outcomes will increase significantly. One way of making people aware of that knowledge gap that is often or like commonly used, but not as much as you would think, given that research shows how much impact it actually has, is a form of pretest. Giving your learners a pretest already means that they have to do some form of retrieval, because they're taking a test. Test means retrieval of knowledge. So they'll already learn or deepen knowledge that they already have by doing the pretest. But it can also show them where their learning gaps are, and they will accept these learning gaps a lot better, and they will also know what they have to focus on. So they have studies have shown that when people already know beforehand where they are lacking knowledge or where they made mistakes, they will focus a lot harder on these areas later on in the course. So you might say, well, this is yet another boring multiple choice test. Again, a test is a test, but it can be a testing scenario where you immerse your people. It can be your multiple choice test. It can be a case study that people have to work through. You have all the options available. It is more about knowing that you should do it and why you should do it and implement it. So make sure you have some form of pretest to build those connections, have your learners accepting their learning needs, and increase learning outcomes with your pretests. Another very important thing, and this is very often forgotten about, I find, is spacing out your learning. There's a lot of discussion about how long a module should be, and people say like, oh, 1 hour a week people can spend. Oh, I just want it to be 5 minutes because this is the longest I get someone to pay attention or whatnot. And it's just like random numbers thrown in. in fact, you don't know, unless you look at your data, for example, how long your people can pay attention. But just because they can pay attention for this much or this much doesn't mean that they learn everything that they are presented with in their time. So when we take breaks from learning, that is when our connections actually grow. That is when it's easier for the neurons to send the new information past these connections. Best break is actually a sleep. Not to encourage your employees to have a nap after every training session, but just for understanding, while we sleep, our brain actually goes through everything that we've learned throughout the day and just strengthens these connections. This is why you might look at making your learning units shorter, as you will have your audience that only learns in chunks anyway, because they feel like they can't take in more at a time. But you always have the people who just want to get it done. And if you have a 60-minute course, they will just go through it, whether they remember or not, whether it feels good for them or not. So what you can do to help your learners space out their learning process, or like have the breaks in between learning, is creating micro-learning, creating these chunks of like modules or micro-modules, and then just like provide your learners with one of these modules a day, for example, or like launch one and then 2 days later launch another one. Or make sure that your learners have only like half an hour a day on your access to your LMS or things like that, whatever works best for you. But if you feel like your learners are not taking enough breaks between learning, just try to find a way to kind of kindly force them to take a break. So breaks can maximize the learning outcomes massively, or will, actually. And to finalize my 6 implications I want to share with you today, interleaving practice is how we make sure that our learners not only learn and then are able to reproduce what they have retained, but ideally they will be able to extract underlying principles and rules that they then can apply in a different context. So it will be a lot more easy for them to find solutions later on in a different scenario, in a different setting than your online course. Interleaving means we're not learning in blocks, one big topic, next big topic, next big topic, but we have small chunks of each topic and then mix them up. So for example, if you need to learn different types of medication, you would not go through all the kind of medication that deals with pain, all the meds that you can use for heart issues, and all the types of antibiotics, but you would mix them up, like a couple of the first one, couple of the second one, third one, and so on, and then mix it up and keep going. And because that way you learn both the unifying attributes of each, but also what differentiates them. And it will help you later with your categorizing skills. And when you learn new stuff, it will just immediately go like, okay, so this one go into this category. Whereas if you just go through by blocks, you will have that issue later, that it's just a lot harder to figure out what box they actually go in and then to remember everything. So, to summarize, let's take a quick breath and quickly recap the data and science foundations that should give direction for our content development. Looking at data, the most viewed or completed content can be a great indication of what your learners like as their online training and what they consider as helpful and what maybe not so much. So use this as guidance for future courses. However, make sure you not just copy and paste everything of the course they like, because it will be hard for them to see the difference in the courses and you just might be too similar and bore your audience. Then the most consumed media type and length of the media type is a very good one, because I have heard so many different recommendations of how long, for example, a video should be to match the attention span of the audience. Now, the bigger your audience gets, the bigger the variety of attention spans probably gets. And And also, like, I hear numbers sometime around 3 minutes, sometimes around 7 minutes, something in between. And still you find cinemas that organize Lord of the Ring nights with people watching for hours, apparently paying some kind of attention. So I'm not saying at all that an all-nighter e-learning course might be most effective, but just be careful with random recommendations that you actually have no control about, but look at your data. So that way you will also make sure that you find the right content type for what kind of media you're going to use, whether it's video or animation or what style of animation. This is just something that general recommendations don't work for. So if you can, look at your data, look at your audience, and really tailor it to their preferences. And for our implications deriving from the science of learning, remember that they are basic but cutting edge. So repeat but very speaks to what we always hear when it comes to e-learning, have video, animation, graphics, and so on. And just a big variety of content types. But looking at the science of learning, you see it's not just a variation of presentation type. The content itself can or should even be sometimes repeated, appropriately, obviously, to ensure that learning happens. A big variety of content types mixed with a big variety of content, so you have a lot of everything, might actually be too much and more confusing than beneficial at the end. When we look at retrieval, that encourages us to really actually have these knowledge checks there at the end, whether you say they're useful or not. That is actually in your hands. Make them useful, make sure it's not just a bunch of questions for the sake of having them there, but put something in, create a way that requires learners to put some effort in to retrieve what they have learned. And not just say, this is another set of boring questions, then you don't get any use out of it. What else do we need? We looked at effort. Effort is something we need to get more comfortable with when creating learning experiences. It's just like nobody wins the Olympics with just going for a short run every morning to enjoy the scenery. So we need more than a pretty look and feel that provides some information. Learners need to work their brains. So here's where scenarios and decision-making exercises come into play. You get your audience to work by actively solving problems, and they won't realize how much effort it actually is they need to put in, but we need that little bit of effort at least. And again, we want our audience to know their learning gaps. So think about a pretest, think about an engaging way of a pretest, whether it's a scenario, case study, could be a group discussion. You can do that via your LMS even as well. Put something up in the forum, people have to discuss this and they're already in the topic and see different point of views and might realize that there are actually things they don't know about the topic just yet. And then spatial learning, as we said, take breaks, give your learners breaks. Microlearning has been popular for a while now, and this will help you just with spacing up learning and also with the next thing, which is the retrieval. So you can use different blocks and make sure your learners learn a little bit about one thing today, a little bit about another thing the next day, and so on. So you can actually control that and therefore increase the learning outcome a lot more. So following these guidelines, all based on what we know about learning from science and research, will get you on the right track to actually get the learning outcomes you want. Of course, this was not a holistic overview of everything to do with learning. We just not fit it all into this webinar. But the point I want to make is that when designing successful learning solution, it's not necessarily what we think of like the most entertaining, all the bells and whistles, blockbuster style, holistic, high-tech scenario that we're thinking of, all the special effects and whatnot. So only if they have an impact on learning, this is when we need to look at these ways. But make sure when you plan and develop your course that you focus on what your learners need to know afterwards, what they need to learn. And so if we use these foundations that we've just been through, we will ensure engaging training solutions that lead our learners to meeting their learning goals, which is what we want. and which is what will be the biggest motivation and also reward for your audience. So this is what we need to focus on. Obviously, there's a lot more to cover and how to make this work. There is a lot out there already in ways of like how to do your graphics and videos and whatnot. But again, think about, is this like a recommendation, or is this something I can actually base on research, based on science, and do I want to go with that? And what is best for my audience? Because these are the people who you're creating your content for. Now, this was a bunch of information in a short time. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And while we wait for the questions to come in, let's have a quick look at VMP eLearning's showreel to give you an idea of how we address all these things that I've just been talking about. So we have a question about the effort is critical issue and how do we avoid repelling the viewer. So this is basically what I was trying to get to with working through scenarios, working through problem solving, where you can make learning engaging without having people to understand that they're doing a lot of effort at the moment. For example, present them with following situation, a client requests you finish the project in 3 months instead of the agreed 6 months with no extra cost. What are the different strategies you can do or you can move forward with? How do you talk to the client? How do you talk to a team? And things like that. And give them different options in the scenario and different outcomes. So for example, sending an email to the client, one option is send an email to the client saying like, no, not possible. How well will that work relationship be in the future? And yes, provide your learner with the outcomes of that. And they might rethink and they might find a different strategy. They might see or give them like a virtual library to say which project management tools do I have available, which approaches, whether it's like whatever you're using in your company, Agile, Waterfall, and so on. How can I best proceed? They can look up, they can read something and then actually apply the knowledge. They will not realize how much they actually learn by going through all that information, but you present them with a lot of information in a short time. So it is one of the adult learning principles that people like that adults like problem solving. They want to be presented with a problem that they need to do something about. And this is, I think, why we also need to have a bit of a shift in how we understand learning, because people think about learning a lot in the ways of like, I need to, reread the text 10 times and I'll remember it better, all the cramming and whatnot. And that sounds like effort, but it's actually useless. Whereas the effort we put in, looking at a topic from all the different perspectives, like in the scenario that I just gave you, is actually a lot more effort for the brain, because you have to create a lot more connections, look at it from very different ways. And so I'm very confident that your learners will be upset about the extra effort. I think they will appreciate that a lot more over having like 20 PowerPoint slides more to present all that information instead of building it into the scenario. And let's see if we have another question. Okay. And so what are methods of collecting records for training compliance perspective? There are, ideally, you have a learning management system set up or using one. And then this really depends on, to get your quantitative data. You look at all the reports you can get from your learning management system, and if you don't think they are enough, there are options like different plugins you can use to get more of that data, or more and more people are using XAPI that already covers a lot of the data that you get, whether it's online or offline learning, and just opens up basically another topic for a webinar, so I'm not going to focus on it too much right now. But yes, basically whatever you have available in your LMS, you can look at XAPI. And you can also always, and this is one of my favorite things, these stats are really important. Depending obviously on how much that is possible in your company, talk to your people, or at least to the relevant stakeholders, obviously, depending on how many people you have involved in certain projects or in your in your learning environment. But this is where you get the best feedback from, to actually hear it from your people, or at least having them send you an email or answer some questions in your learning management system. But talking to the stakeholders, saying if anything if their team had a shift in the whole learning culture, or in however they perform, or things like that. This sometimes can be even better than the stats that you get. Or I would say the combination of both of them is ideal, because you see what your data says, but you can also see if it says someone has actually gone through the whole course for 30 minutes. If you actually talk to the person and say I actually just had it running in the background because I felt I didn't have really time to do it. I know I had to do it, but I have so much work, so I couldn't really focus on it. That gives you a response that is a lot better than what you can get from your data alone. And I think, yes, there's one more question. There you go. For interleaving practices, is there a method to know when or how much to address each principle? That is a very good question. That really depends, sorry to say this, that depends on the content. So how much to address each principle? I would say you have this is something where you really focus on what do you want the learning outcome to be, or what kind of information do your learners need to retain, and what is some additional information that supports learning and they don't want. And this is something where I would come back to the beginning, if you can, hopefully, and the data-driven learning design. Tailor it, or design it to what you have available, the data you have available, and the knowledge. What do you think works? And then release your course. And then, not after half a year or something, do an evaluation if it actually worked, but use data-driven learning design principles to, over the couple of hours or couple of days after you released it, monitor engagement and learning outcomes and interaction. And if you feel like you did not achieve what you wanted, immediately update your course and focus on or address each principle more or less. You'd also, because the question was also when to address each principle, sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes you need to start with the basic knowledge. It depends on whether you're building up knowledge, or if it's like like the example with the medications. I personally don't think it matters in what order you learn, but maybe a pharmacist will now say, well, it actually does, because one is like one has all the ingredients that the next one has, plus some other things. Then obviously it would make more sense to start with the basic one and then the one that tops up. If you don't think that there is one that is like the basic one that you should start with, this is a very good opportunity to bring in learner-led training. So let your learners choose what they want to start with first. And then you catch them with, like, in the situation where they have the brain space for exactly this topic. When they are open for it, when they say, this is the one that I'm actually the most interested in, and you give them the power and control. So they will actually be more motivated to start this exercise than when you tell them where to start with. So yeah, it's a very good question. And I hope this answer helped. And yes, the next question is, do you have a preferred method of understanding your users' gaps of knowledge? The answer is, I don't have a preferred way. I have different ways depending on the situation. I am a big fan of Cathy Moore's approach of action mapping, which is you talk to your relevant stakeholders and actually look at what people need to do in their everyday work life to perform appropriately, to succeed, to do their tasks. This obviously involves some time. So if you are taking the way of a pretest, as I've talked about in this webinar, I personally am a big fan of starting with scenarios or case studies or anything that has a real life relevance for your audience, because it doesn't make them feel too much like they have to do a test. They don't feel tested. They are more likely, or you can show the relevance of the knowledge a lot more. Let's say they do a regular multiple choice test and they see like, okay, I got 50% right. Obviously I have some learning to do. Fair enough, they might do some learning. If you provide them with, let's stay with the medication and drugs scenario. If they are working in a lab, for example, and think they already know it all, however, you give them a scenario where they have to interact with specific machines or whatnot, and they take decisions throughout that scenario that end up in either medication being contaminated or, just a lab accident with some bad outcomes. This will obviously not have a massive effect in this scenario because it is a virtual environment. However, if this happened in the real lab, this would be like major damage. So people will actually realize, hang on, I really got this wrong and I could have killed that many people. But this is when the acceptance of learning something new is really high and you really get them motivated and also their brain all wired up already to take in that new information that you'll present them with. There are other ways of understanding the gaps, again, is like talking to people, assessing, or looking at actually any kind of reports that you have from the last couple of months or years, whatnot, like let's say how many accidents have happened, how high is staff turnover, and do we have reasons from the last interview of like why this might be and things like that, where you can say like, okay, I have 5 people leaving because they felt they're not well enough prepared for their everyday tasks. These are all things that can give you hints of like what to focus on and where the gaps are. And ideally, you look at everything you have available as thoroughly as possible to really get the content right. And also to get internal buy-in. As I understand, this is often hard within a company to get everyone on board with your ideas, and just presenting like a whole report on like everything you've looked at will obviously help massively. And so one more question coming? No, okay. So I hope I could cover everything, but again, I'm always open to discuss some questions. Always open for some challenges, some questions that I have to think about or whatnot. So please, get in touch or at least connect on LinkedIn. It's always good to connect with like-minded people who are interested in the industry or do their own great stuff that I'm interested in sharing knowledge. And thank you so much for being part of this today and all your questions. You can always email me or hit me up on LinkedIn, send me your questions or give me a call and we can discuss whatever you are interested in or whatever thoughts might come up later on. So here are my details. And as promised, I don't want to hide my references from you. This is just a small selection that I think is really good to hit up. But there's a lot more out there. And obviously, any further questions, please get in touch anytime. And thank you for listening and being part of this today.